thank you guys for allowing me to speak with you, to be your speaker for today. No, so it's an honor for me to talk to Mapuats. I have so many friends na Mapuats, but it's very heartwarming that GPCS reached out. No, number one, because it's my first time to talk to Puan students, and second, it's the topic that I will be talking. It's not about my work. It's more about one of my hobbies. So Raspberry Pi grew as a hobby for me. No? So it's a good thing that we know this because it might help you in the future in terms of your project designs or thesis in your graduating years. Okay, so again, hello. I'm AJ Canlas, so you can call me AJ for short. So I'm a part-time faculty in TIPQC Computer Engineering Department. So I'm a cloud technical architect and SME in Red Hat Technologies and MDI Novare, as well as I'm an alumnus of TIPQC Computer Engineering. So let's start off what is really Raspberry Pi, right? So I don't know what's the understanding, but I think we need to talk about it more clearly. What really a Raspberry Pi is. So Raspberry Pi, or RPi for short, is a SBC. So when we say SBC, it's a single board computer. So it's a computer that it's not movable. You cannot remove any parts of it if it's already because it's already soldered on the board. So it has some objectives to that it aims. So number one, it aims to provide a compact computing board for portability. So and number two, it's an affordable alternative to the current computing trend. So when you buy a with the same specs of what Raspberry Pi has, it's actually cheaper to get a Raspberry Pi in the long run. Then number three, it provides a platform for the unreached places to learn programming. So just for stopping in this slide, so Raspberry Pi Foundation was founded in the UK. Then they thought, how can I reach more people like in Utah or people in unreached places like in Africa? How can I give them platforms or computers without bringing that bulk right those bulky system units to the crowd. So they thought of a solution. What if I will use that the current technologies that I have back in 2012 when they established Raspberry Pi Foundation and use it and for me as a teaching tool. So first it was about programming, but right now they're more focused on delivering better performance on those spies because actually some companies are using it for the use cases that I will discuss later. So these are the models so that you will be familiar. If you see one, if especially if someone sold you a Raspberry Pi, sinasabi niya na bago to, this is the latest, you need to know what it really looks like. Kasi I happen to know people that kahit students, kahit I know that you're very intelligent students, meron mga naluloko pa rin. So at least look at this and yung slides naman will be shared sa inyo later. Look at this pictures so that you would know what really the latest and what is the oldest. You know? So yeah, so basically this is more of a showcase of all the models of Raspberry Pi has already delivered from 2012 until today 2021. So 2012 they started Raspberry Pi A. So it's a single core 32-bit ARM CPU. So it has a microprocessor that is on an ARM architecture. So our normal PC that you use, unless you're on a Mac or an Apple M1 user, if you're using a normal PC, an Intel or an AMD gaming PC that you're using, it's actually on an x86-64 architecture. So that's what we have used for quite some time. So we came from Power architecture, then the Unix boxes, then we went to x86. So everything is now in x86. But the Raspberry Pi Foundation said that this is cheap and it can work. So back in 2012, a one core with 256 MB RAM So di pa yata kaya mag-run ng Chrome yan, ganyan kaonte, no? So 256 MB RAM was a big deal back in the day in 2012. And it has 26 GPIOs. So later we will talk about the GPIO pins later. Then in 2013, they said that I can improve this thing. So they created Raspberry Pi B. So it's a single core, but it has double the RAM. You have now 512 MB. Yan, so half of a gig. So at least medyo malapit na sa katotohanan. But the major advancement of this model is that it has an Ethernet. So you can connect it now to the network. Previously, it doesn't have anything. It just have a USB Type A that you can put an external Ethernet, but now it's built in the computer or in the board. So it actually this is quite old. So remember that actually my friend who said, "Bro, I bought a Raspberry Pi lately. Nabili ko lang siya ng mga 2,000 pesos, sobrang mura." Because I was telling him that I buy Raspberry Pi. So I go, sige, patingin. And I saw that it's a 2013 Raspberry Pi B. So it's practically useless. And I told him, bro, sorry, naloko ka. And you got scammed, obviously. So, mag-ingat kayo doon sa ano na yan. Kaya yun. So, nakita niya, na-realize din niya na ano. But back in 2013, this was a beast, diba? So, even though na kahit na paano naka 4 gig, 2 gig na yung mga tao, some people are using dual cores, but using a computer that is on the size of a credit card, it's a big thing. I can hook this up to a monitor, plug a keyboard, and I can use it as a computer. It's a really big thing back in the day, and I can connect now with the internet, because it has at least 100 MB Ethernet built into that. Then it evolves. On 2014, they released two versions. It has the A plus and the B plus. So the A plus is basically a iteration from A, but the difference is that it has a faster single core 32-bit ARM. So I think they went from 200 to 500 megahertz on that single core ARM CPU. It still has 256 MB RAM, and now you would have 40 GPIO. So later we'll talk about the GPIOs and how important that it became 40 in this time and age. Of course, the B plus is the same. It has a faster ARM CPU, and it has a 512 megabits of RAM. So that's the difference. Plus, it is now from 26 GPIO to 40 GPIO. Then the breakout happened. 2015, this is the most sold Raspberry Pi in the world. So Raspberry Pi 2. So it has a gig of a RAM, and it has 2 cores. In 2015, I don't know what year or what grade you are in 2015, but in 2015, I still remember myself as a college student, and I have a dual core 2 gig RAM laptop. And it was a big deal back then that you have at least 2 gig or 4 gig, and even 8 gig back in the day. So remember, now I can have a credit card size computer, as in credit card size, so kasi laki ng ID nyo, but it has 2 cores in 1 gig RAM. So it's practically faster on the majority of the computers on that era. So kaya ang nangyari, what happened nung time na yon, some of the schools here in the Philippines, especially sa provinces, they removed all their bulky Pentium 2, Pentium 3 PC, then they used this Raspberry Pi 2B. And that's when Raspberry Pi became very popular here in the Philippines, 2014, 2015. Those are the days. Then it evolves. 2016, you have Raspberry Pi 3B. So it has 4 cores, so it's now quad core. 1 gig pa rin yung RAM, 40 GPIO, but now it has Wi-Fi. So I owned actually a Raspberry Pi 2 back in the day. Then what I do, I went to CDR King, buhay pa si CDR King noon. Then I bought a USB dongle that has a Wi-Fi receiver. So just for me to have Wi-Fi. But here it is already built in on the board, so which is crazy back in 2016. Then they kind of slack after 2 years. They created two new boards, which is the Raspberry Pi A plus and the B plus. So as you see, the B plus and the B doesn't have much difference, but actually it's just a faster CPU. That's the innovation that they did on the Raspberry Pi 3B plus. So the thing is, you can really buy a 3B, which is very cheap than the B plus. But I really recommend for you to get the B plus because B, 3B has a power issue. So sometimes pumuputok yan for some reason. That's why, as you see in the picture, parang may mga metal na siya dun sa mga CPU niya dito. Yan. Kasi they found out that that quad core is very powerful and sometimes pwede sila mag-short. So, nilagyan nila ng, actually, it's a, I forgot the metal that they put on top so that it will not short anymore. So, yun yung ginawa nila. But 3B still works. Basta pa napatay-patay lang. So, that's the ano. Actually, right now, it's still, you can still buy it, but be aware lang for the poachers na will sell you very, very high price. Yun. So, moving forward from 2018, we went now from 2019 up to today. So 2019, we have actually that's Raspberry Pi 4B, Raspberry Pi 4. Now it's 4 cores, 64-bit RAM, ARM architecture. Why they went from 32 to 64-bit? Number one, 32 is practically dead, and number three is uh, it now supports 8 gig RAM. So I don't know about you, but most of my students in TIP they have on an average 8 gig RAM. So I can literally buy today a Raspberry Pi 4 4B with 8 gig RAM with a 1 gigabit Ethernet and 5 gigahertz na Wi-Fi, which is some of the laptops in the market today is much slower than this beast. So I forget to put the picture, but I actually own before Magtalk, I actually own 7 Raspberry Pi. So I sold everything na kasi because I bought servers na kasi. So I own 7 Raspberry Pis na 8 gig RAM. So I use it for later pag-uusapan natin yan. So yun, it's really good. I mean, malaki talaga yung performance improvement when you use yung Raspberry Pi 3B Plus and yung 4B. Ang laki ng improvement because I can run Windows in this Raspberry Pi and na smooth kasi you can run really Windows back in a Raspberry Pi 2 but it's really slow. Dito ano na siya, it's as if it's a desktop na usable. So, which is really big advancement. So, yun yung one of the things it's kind of blowing right now in the market. So, nag-pandemic lang, kaya medyo mahirap siyang bilhin. But in reality, this is one of the best na nagawa na ng Raspberry Pi. And naghahanap pa sila ng ways how to optimize it, maybe a better core better CPU, at least 8 cores, tas gawin 16 gig RAM. Titignan pa nila. Yun. So, if you buy one, ang problem lang dito, from Raspberry 3 to Raspberry 4, yung yung power niya, it's Type-C. So, dati, you're using yung Type-B, yung usual natin na micro USB. Here, they're using Type-C USB na I don't know, medyo may challenge kasi sa pag-acquire ng mga charges na gano'n. And medyo maselan siya. So you can't use Huawei branded. I don't know if it's racist. Just lang. Huawei, lahat ng China brand, Huawei, Vivo, Oppo, na Type-C, ayaw niya, hindi niya tinatanggap for some reason, even though the voltage is tama. Samsung mag-on siya saglit pero mamamatay din siya. That's why they have this official Raspberry Pi charger that has the same wattage ng normal na charger. Ang pinakaiba lang niya may pangsalo siya ng charge back. So it happens na medyo nagkamali ito sa architecture, and it has a capacitor that charges pabalik yung yung kuryente ng maliit na volts lang, mga millivolts lang. And problem doon, ma-interrupt kasi yung may-interrupt kasi yung power. So magre-restart yung Raspberry Pi mo. So, and siguro yung mga Chinese branded na Huawei, Oppo, and Vivo, they have this capability to anti-charge back yung anti-negative power. So, kaya hindi talaga siya nag-charge. Kaya that's why you need to buy a official power supply for this guy. But it's sulit, sobrang sulit kasi you can have that power at least 4 cores and 8 gig RAM. If you compute it, mas mura yan kaysa bumili ka ng desktop kung kung cheapo lang naman yung bibili mong desktop, okay na yan as an alternative. Okay, so last is yung mga spin-offs nila. So they have spin-offs in the side na which is not their main brand, Raspberry Pi. So merong Raspberry Pi Zero, so it's half of a credit card, but it's of course weaker. So it has 40 GPIO pins din, and it has 512 yata na RAM ang pagkakatanda ko. There is a non Ethernet and Ethernet version. Non-Wi-Fi in Wi-Fi version. So always get the Wi-Fi one. So I think that's 0W. May ganun siyang may ganun siyang code name. If you want something pang wearable project in the future. So it needs to be small, diba? So half of a card, you can make a watch or anything that you can make kabit sa katawan mo. So that's something, pero mahina lang siya. It's 512 MB, so you need to be patient lang. So yun. Then they had this crazy idea to have a board that already has a keyboard inserted in it. So that's the Raspberry Pi 400. It's actually a 4 gig model of a Raspberry Pi 4. It just so happened it has its own keyboard. So kasi nga ang use case mo nga naman, I mean their use case was really to give these boards going to the unreached para mag-programming. However, pagdating doon, ang nasisira parati keyboard. Kasi naghihiraman, tapos 24 halos malaki yung yan. Hold on a second. Yan, sige. May problem lang dun sa video ko, nag-flicker siya kanina. Okay. Sige. So, yan. So, basically, yan yung ginawa ng Raspberry Pi 400. Now, they have this, noong 2021, they released a tawag nila Raspberry Pi Pico or Pico. I don't know if how to pronounce it, but they said Pico on that day. So Raspberry Pi Pico, it's a microcontroller. So don't be confused later pag-uusapan natin ano pinagkaiba ng microprocessor versus a microcontroller. So basically, Pico is a microcontroller. So ang kamukha niya is Arduino. And later pag-uusapan natin what's the difference. Okay? So next is pag-usapan natin yun. Sakto. Yung what are the jargons in RPi. So, yung mga definitions na medyo nalilito yung maraming tao. So, yung una is GPIO. So, it's general purpose input-output. So, it's pins. Yun yung nakikita natin kanina, yung kanina na from 26 naging 40. Yun yung nagde-deliver or nagre-receive ng voltages for sensors and actuators. So you can make some robotics na merong OS sa loob. So that's quite a advancement. So that's why Raspberry Pi is usually used in IoT projects and IoT and hardware or embedded projects. Yon. Then you have ito yung microprocessor and microcontroller. So microcontrollers, ang mga example niyan is Arduino, Uno, Arduino, yung mga ganon. Then may Gizduino, I don't know if you have heard about them. So sila yung mga microcontroller. Ang pinakaiba kasi, microprocessor is a part of a whole system unit. So, ano siya, it's a part of a computer. And it's an aggregated microcontroller. But microcontrollers are not computers. So, kung tutuusin, they are a bunch of transistors that makes a computer like function. Okay, so that's the difference. So Raspberry Pi microprocessor, it's a computer. It's part of a computer. And microcontroller, it's not a computer. It's just a computer. It's a bunch of transistors that you can code in it. No, so yun ang difference. Okay. So skills you need for you to 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 use Raspberry Pi. So there are three na gusto kong i-highlight. So Linux administration, you need to know how to use Linux. So because Raspberry Pi is a computer, it has an operating system. So again, kanina pwede ka nga talaga mag-Windows. However, ang pinaka base niya is really Linux based. So Raspbian siya by default. Then hardware engineering. So since may GPIO siya, you can use it for sensors and actuators. Nasa iyo na yun kung saan mo siya gagamitin. Then lastly is network administration. So ang downfall ng ibang mga tao, and this is true, when you go to some job, yung mga freelancing job, may mga tao na hindi marunong mag network administrate, pero they know how to hardware engineer and they know how to Linux administer kahit paano. So the problem on that is they don't know how to connect to a server, how to push their yung nakuha nila sa sensors pataas dun sa mga so that's the problem with them. So at least you need to know a bunch of network administration. Yan. So lastly, what are the projects that I've done, no? So ano ba yung mga nagawa ko na on the past years that I've done with Raspberry Pi? So number one, it's yung quad drone implementation. So I used Raspberry Pi 3s, a bunch of Raspberry Pi 3s. So 4 na drones yon. Bago pa lang yung machine learning nun. Then I use it as a flight controller. So if you know the things with drones, you can flight controllers is the one that kind of controls your drone. Kung ano ba ang tamang voltage ng 4 na rotors na nasa 4 sa sa pagiging drone niya para stable siya, tumaas at bumaba. So we used machine learning. Meron kaming server on the back, and si Raspberry Pi is connecting via Wi-Fi. Actually via 3G pa noon 3G o 4G. Via internet yung naging niya. So it's an IoT project. Then next is what I've done is IoT Home. So yung IoT Home is actually professionally ko itong ginawa. It means binayaran kami. OJT ko rather. It's a power and water consumption monitoring. So and ginagamit na siya ngayon ng mga ng mga friends natin sa Cebu and Davao. So meron silang doon that they can change yung metro nila. Then meron yung SIM card sa loob, nandun yung Raspberry Pi sa loob. Then it sends the data upward dun sa sa mga sensors. So ang maganda doon, wala na yung kailangan mag-check ng metro nyo. Na siya, automatic na siya nakikita. Kahit ikaw, nakikita mo transparent kung magkano yung consumption mo and how much yung babayaran mo for that day. So ang next step namin doon is to use data analytics to flatten. Paano, kunwari gusto ko, budget ko lang for power is 5,000 example. Ano yung kailangan ko i-cut off? Sasabihin niya sa akin, cut off the aircon, cut off the ganun. So that's the next step of that, pero hindi pa namin nasisimulan for some reason. Next is I made a cloud platform. So since RPi runs on Linux, basically you can build your own cloud platform, a private cloud. So like OpenStack. So I deployed, kaya nagkaroon ako ng 7 dito before I sold it. I create actually an OpenStack cluster based on Raspberry Pi. Then, of course, I can create a storage platform then. So since, again, it runs on Linux, I can build my own storage platform, like Ceph. So Ceph is an open source storage platform. that can manage storages. So para siyang NFS or NAS, if you may. No, so that's my Raspberry Pi journey. And to finish off this, I will end with this saying, no, without solid foundation, you will have trouble creating anything of value. So it's nice that you want to know about Raspberry Pi, and I adore it. I love students. I love people that wants to know this stuff. But I want to reiterate, you need to have those skills before: hardware engineering, network administration, and Linux administration, for you to create anything of a value. That's your foundation, yung mga skills na yan. So that you can create the most out of those hardware before ka gumastos. So it came from Erica Oppenheimer. And with that, thank you for having me. Any questions?
Now, if you have any questions for our speaker, kindly raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged before unmuting yourself. You may also send your questions through the chat box.
There is a question na yata. Sabi ni John Christian Diamante, do you have suggestions for ebooks that tackle the basics of Raspberry Pi? I think the basics of Raspberry Pi is not a book about Raspberry Pi itself, right? So ironically, that's how it is, no? So it's not about Raspberry Pi itself muna. So what I suggest, maybe take a course about Linux administration first, how to manage Linux, how to manage networks, and yun mga ganon. That's the basics kasi. After nun, mas madali ka na makagamit ng Raspberry Pi. It will be way easier for you. Kasi yun yung naging observation namin. We deployed this to kids, not kids, high school students. They're not kids, they're young adults. Young adults, tapos tinry nila Raspberry Pi. Tapos tinry namin, may GUI yung OS, tapos nag-scratch sila. It's a programming language na drag and drop. Nakita namin, even though that they have the idea of having that logic, nahirapan sila to navigate. Ang hirap, hindi nila alam paano pumunta dun sa Scratch application, paano pag nag-crash siya, how to check kung buhay pa yung Raspberry Pi niya, kung na-disconnect siya. So those are the things that matter most. Na kung tutuusin, yung dapat na 4-week na na session namin, naging 8 weeks because of those difficulties. So siguro yun muna yung basics. Yung Linux, dapat marunong ka na mag-Linux, marunong ka kahit paano you understand how hardware works, yung mga sensors and actuators, and network administration. Tapos saka ka mag-Raspberry Pi, it would be way easier for you. Kasi when I handled Raspberry Pi, I know this stuff na eh. And it was easier for me. So, I don't know if that helps. Kasi I don't really recommend yung mga ebook ng Raspberry Pi because they would go directly na, kabit mo tong sensor na to, kabit mo tong sensor na to. Tapos ito, ilagay mo tong code na to. Wala ka natutunan kung natutusin. It's just a copy-paste thing. Tapos wala masyadong information sa mga current na ebooks ng Raspberry Pi. Yeah, unfortunately, no. So that's why I highly recommend study those basics sa pumunta Raspberry Pi. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
So is there another participant that wants to ask a question? Okay, Christopher.
Sir, you mentioned that we should take up courses regarding Linux administration. Are there any resources available on the net that you would recommend, such as courses on Linux administration?
Hold on. Wait, I have a list for that. You're familiar with Udemy and Friends, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay, wait lang. Udemy, ano pa ba yung iba? Udemy, edX, yun, edX. Ito yung malaking makakatulong sa inyo. intro, fundamentals. Yeah, this should suffice for Linux administration. Yan. Dalawang link yan. One is introduction, number 2 is fundamentals of Red Hat Linux. So, not really directly for but it's Linux pa rin. Magaganda yung mga niya, content niya. So, save niya lang yan. Okay. Christian James Encio said, "Sir, what are the advantages and disadvantages of RPi over Arduino?" Number 1, RPi is a computer. So you need to think of it na ito, computer to. Hindi ko, kung tutuusin, I can create my projects within the Raspberry Pi itself. Okay? So I can create my own security level based on Raspberry Pi. Yun yung unang advantage niya over Arduino. Arduino kasi it's a microcontroller. Kailangan ko mag-code at i-upload ko yung code na yun sa Arduino. And I don't know if it works or not. Diba? I mean, I can debug, do some debug sa pero hindi ko alam kung ano yung magiging behavior niya sa Arduino. Unlike sa Raspberry Pi, I can do it real time. Yung code ko, magko-code ako, ira-run ko lang siya, makikita ko what's the output. Kung working with sensors yun, mas mabilis pagka sa Raspberry Pi. Number 2, Arduino uses analog and digital pins. Diba? So meron ka lang few digital pins and you have bunch of maraming analog pins. Tama ba? Analog, digital. Yeah, correct. So the beauty of GPIO, they work as both. They can be analog and they can be digital at the same time. I don't know if I interchange them so sa Arduino, but basically you can have them both in one pin rather than in Arduino onti lang yung pwede yung magamit. May limitation yung digital yata or yung analog. It's either way. So yun yung notable advantage of notable advantage ng Raspberry Pi to everyone.
So, sir, we have a question from our FB Live viewer. Sir, ask ko lang po, mahirap po ba sa C# ang RPi?
Yun, good. C#. Wait lang. C#. Actually, inisip ko kung di yan nagkakamali. Yeah, correct. So, C# kasi became open source na back in 2010. So, what happened, C# kasi it's very Microsoft, diba? It's highly Microsoft siya dati. Kung C#, pag sinabi mo C#, C++, ganun, it's very Microsoft yung thinking mo. Now, in this time and age, C# is actually ported to Linux. You can use C# na. So, mahirap pag gamitin si Raspberry Pi sa C#. Not really, as long as marunong ka mag C#. I mean, I don't mind as long as you can use C#. What I highly recommend kasi usually in Raspberry Pi, you use Python. Why? Python kasi directly interacts with the GPIO pins. Yun lang yung reason. Pero I don't think if, hindi ko alam kung merong C# libraries na that can interact with the GPIO pins. But I think baka meron ng nakagawa and you can leverage that. So in terms of hirap, pag hindi ka marunong mag C#, syempre mahirap siya. Pero if you know that, it's easy. It's relatively easy.